All right, I think we are about ready to get started. Thank you everyone on the line for joining us for another round of our Allocating Water for Natural Areas webinar series. Today we're going to be focusing on the Santa Cruz River. This is a river of international significance that heads south from Arizona's San Rafael Valley, makes a 25-mile loop through Sonora, Mexico, and eventually returns to the United States near Nogales. Once a free-flowing river marked with springs and cienegas, the Santa Cruz now owes the majority of its flow to treated effluent. So we are joined today by Claire Zugmeyer of the Sonoran Institute. She is an ecologist working for the Institute's Sun Corridor Legacy Program, and she's going to tell us a little bit more about this river and some of the work that the Sonoran Institute is doing.
Thank you, Steve. Hopefully everyone can hear me well. I'm really happy that this webinar is happening today and not yesterday because we were having severe technology issues in our office yesterday. So this is good timing. And thank you again for the invitation to share our work. For those of you who aren't familiar with Sonoran Institute, we are a conservation nonprofit working to connect people in the West with the natural resources that sustain them. And we're founded in Tucson, so we've been working in some capacity in the Santa Cruz watershed for over 25 years now. And today I'm going to share with you our living river work and what we've been doing to track conditions along the stretches as Steve mentioned, that are now flowing with effluent. So with that, to give a larger context, so we all know that water is life, but many of you are part of this action network because you know how important water is, and we want to protect our rivers. And Arizona actually has a lot of rivers. This is a map that Nature Conservancy did in, I believe, in 2010, and they mapped the status of all of our rivers. And there's blue are the perennial stretches, and actually, let me back up just one moment. So while riparian areas are common, we see a lot of lines on this map. They only represent 2% of the landscape of Arizona, and yet are critical for over 90% of the wildlife at some point during their life cycle. And so we have a lot of perennial stretches, but water is of course important for humans too, and so we add humans to the landscape. And we now have stretches of our rivers that become regulated when we put in dams, or become formerly perennial either because of dams altering flows or because we have groundwater pumping that makes the level of the groundwater too low to support surface water flows. And if we zoom into the bottom of the map, we have our Santa Cruz River that had stretches that were formerly perennial and now have effluent stretches that are supported with release of effluent. And so it might not be a totally natural system, but it's providing a lot of key benefits, habitat for our wildlife, recharge of our groundwater aquifers, as well as just creating flowing stretches that are important for recreation and enjoyment. We all like our flowing rivers. So why should we even care about the Santa Cruz in the first place? I'm not sure where everybody lives, but if any of you are in the Tucson region, the Santa Cruz is the reason that you can call Tucson home. I moved to the area in 2003 and thought that our desert rivers were just, always dry except for when it rained, and that's just the new concept of rivers in Arizona. But in actuality, the Santa Cruz had many locations that were flowing year-round, and that's where people were first able to settle. And so our flowing Santa Cruz River is what allowed us to have the rich heritage that we have and cultural heritage in the area. And we actually have over 12,000 years of rich history, and I'm always fascinated by the fact that we have the longest continuous record of agriculture in North America. So we've had, even though we're in this dry, arid environment, we've had a continuous record of agriculture for a long time. And that's because of the Santa Cruz and the associated groundwater in the region. And a lot of our rich history is covered in a publication that we released a couple of years ago called State of the Santa Cruz River. It's available on our website for anyone that wants to learn a little more about the history and how the river changed over time. So with many of our western rivers, we have a lot of impacts that change our flowing stretches. They end up drying, but not too long ago. So let me just back up. Oops. So this is a view at the base of a mountain near downtown Tucson. And not too long ago, this is the same view in the early 1900s, looking north towards Catalinas. And we see that the river was flowing and there was riparian vegetation. And now many people just assume, okay, the river is dry because this scene does not exist anymore. The river through the downtown stretch is mostly dry, and we have vegetation that can survive having just periodic flows of stormwater. But thanks to our effluent, releases of effluent, we still have stretches of the river that flow. In the upper corner is a photo of what we call the Upper Santa Cruz, so the stretch of the river in Santa Cruz County. As Steve mentioned at the beginning, the river actually starts in the San Rafael Valley in Arizona, flows into Mexico, where it still has some natural flows, and then dries up as you get closer to the U.S. and starts flowing again downstream of the Nogales wastewater treatment plant. And then in the lower photo, we have the stretch of the river in the northwest part of Tucson, where we have releases of effluent from our two major regional treatment facilities in the Tucson area. And many people are very surprised about the Tucson stretch. They don't realize that the river is flowing year-round. So we have this water that's being allocated to the river, maybe not for specific environmental purposes, but it is happening. And just to give you an aerial view of what this looks like, again, in the upper corner, this is the Nogales wastewater treatment facility near Nogales, Arizona, and you see a dry riverbed. It's a little harder in this image to see. I don't know if you see my mouse, but there's the outfall then starts a ribbon of green that snakes off into the background, and that ribbon of green is more apparent in the Tucson area because it's closer in photo. But we have here the first, on the lower photo, the first wastewater facility. We have a dry riverbed, and then we have this outfall of water, and suddenly we get this bright ribbon of green that goes off into the distance. And so we're creating this important riparian vegetation with our effluent, as well as recharging our aquifers. But with effluent, effluent being a source of human wastewater has all sorts of extra things in the water that wouldn't be in natural water. So there's some inherent challenges with wastewater or with effluent. And so, both of these all three facilities along the river were upgraded so that the water released into the river was of a much higher quality. And Sonoran Institute was really interested in documenting the changes from these and how do we understand the conditions, river health conditions along these stretches of the river, and how do we help keep the community informed. And our living river work really started on the Upper Santa Cruz. So I'm going to start the story there, and then we'll move downstream. But in 2005, there was a die-off of cottonwood trees, and for over an 8-mile stretch, cottonwood and willows. And that was really the catalyst for trying to understand why, or try to understand on an annual basis, the river health. You know, the community was completely caught by surprise and didn't understand why this was happening. And so we worked with a committee to develop 10 indicators of river health that we reported on an annual basis for the 2008, 2009, and 2010 water years. And in 2009, the upgrade to the Nogales Wastewater International Treatment Plant happened. And so we just had this perfect before, during, and after study. And since then, we released a report last year that is available online as well, that looks at the changes over the last 7 years, so from 2008 to 2014. So I'm going to share with you what we've been seeing on the Upper Santa Cruz. In that report, there's an executive summary that summarizes all of the observations, and then there's detailed fact sheets for each indicator. We actually, for this 7-year report, added some additional indicators. I think we have 12. I'm not going to touch on all of them right now, but if you're interested in knowing more, those are available online. You can just search on the Sonoran Institute website, Living River, and you'll find all of our Living River publications. So just to remind you of where, so we're on the Upper Santa Cruz. You know, the river flows north, so up means south. I think a lot of people think up is north. And so upper, we're talking about downstream of Nogales International Plant, and we have 3 reaches that we are looking at: the Rio Rico Reach, the Tubac Reach, and the Amado Reach. And in terms of water quality, a big important thing that happened with the upgrade to the treatment plant was reduction in the amount of nutrients. And ammonia is one form of nitrogen that is very common in wastewater, and so would be higher in the effluent that is released. And so ammonia is, so just to orient you to the graph, so we have ammonia charted, and then we have the years of data within each reach. So the 3 reaches are moving from left to right. We're going from upstream to downstream. So unfortunately, in the Amado reach, we didn't have any data before the upgrade, but presumably the water quality followed the same pattern as the other 2 reaches. And what you see is before the treatment upgrade, which is represented by the dotted line, we had very, very high levels of ammonia in the water, which was one of the main reasons for upgrading the process, so the treatment process. And after the upgrade, very low levels, and very often ammonia is not even detected in the river anymore, which is really important for fish and other wildlife living in the water. Fish in particular are impacted by ammonia because it's toxic at high levels. And so bringing that down is key for the fish species. Also important for your aquatic wildlife is oxygen. This is another variable that's common indicator of river health, is levels of dissolved oxygen. And for all of our indicators, we're comparing things to either standards or to a baseline. And ammonia was too complicated to show the standard on here on the graph. But for oxygen, the standard the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality has set is 1 milligram per liter between sunset and 3 hours after sunrise. And this is for effluent dependent streams and is a very low amount. In your natural flowing stream, you want about 6 on average. So just to put that in perspective. And so you can see that even though, and when data points fall in the green area, it meets the standard. If it falls in the blue area, it does not meet the standard. And both before and after the upgrades, the levels of dissolved oxygen met the standard, but in all 3 reaches, we saw an increase in the amount of dissolved oxygen, which is really good news for the aquatic species. And even in the Amado reach, if you see the little hash marks at the bottom, we're seeing an increased number of dry days, but even when there is water present, there's still enough oxygen in the water, with the exception, there's a few outliers, but so ammonia decreasing, oxygen increasing, very important for our fish. And we have an annual fish survey that we do with partners, multiple partners, and excited to find fish. And the fish are returning to the river, which is really excellent news. So when I first started at Sonoran Institute, I went on a fish survey in 2007, and we found literally no fish. And then in 2008, the first survey for the Living River series, we found 1 species and literally 2 individual fish, one in the Tubac reach and one in the Amado reach. And then as soon as we had the upgrade in 2009, the numbers of fish increased dramatically. And just to note, we're not trying to determine population numbers, but the level of effort is fairly, we try to maintain the same amount of effort, but we're not trying to determine the population. So this is just a relative estimate of fish. We also saw western mosquito fish come back, though those dropped off again in later years. And it's possible that that happened because we started seeing more drying in the Amado reach, and maybe conditions are more favorable for the native fish, which is the longfin dace, which is always good to favor the native. And most exciting that some of you may have heard about is that the Gila top minnow came back and has been found 2 years in a row now. So they're not in that graph because I only graphed through 2014, but the Gila top minnow is an endangered native fish that used to be found in the Upper Santa Cruz that had disappeared. I think it hadn't been seen in over 10 years. And we were waiting for it to come back because we knew that it had been found in Mexico in the flows that are in the areas that are still flowing, and likely some of the tributaries. So it was just a matter of waiting for the flood flows to bring the fish. Now that the water quality was better, it was just a matter of time. And so that was really exciting to finally see them again. So in terms of flow extent, what we're seeing, this is a new indicator that's not in the first 3 reports, but we were very interested in water quantity for several reasons. So one thing that with the improved water quality, we actually saw the water recharging faster in the river, and even without trying to track it, we noticed that the river wasn't flowing as far north as it used to before the upgrades. And actually, some research that was done at the U of A, one of the reasons that there was that die-off of cottonwood and willow along the river is because the water quality had become so poor that it created this clogging layer. So all the organisms that break down ammonia and other nutrients in the water had become so abundant that in the riverbed that they sealed it off and prevented water from infiltrating into the aquifer. And so we essentially had kind of this lined channel with water flowing in it, but the trees along the river couldn't access any of that water. Combine that with, not less rain and not enough floods to come through and scour the river bottom, and a perfect storm is how it's been characterized for the riparian vegetation. And then we have the upgrade happen, and we now have much cleaner water going to the river, and we're poking some holes into our clogging layer and creating a Swiss cheese effect. And over time, that layer is disappearing, and we're having greater recharge, which is really important for both the trees getting water and recharging local groundwater supply, which is important for local wells. But on the flip side of that, we have fewer miles of flowing river, which is bad for in having a lot of aquatic habitat, but is really important that the system is functioning in a more natural way now. And so we added miles of flow over the years to look at changing flow extent. And so in June, it's the driest time of year right before the monsoon season, where we would expect kind of the minimum flow extent. And we have a few points along the river where we can measure whether the river was there, and then there's some uncertainty. And so we know for sure the river was flowing in June during the solid bar portion, and then and possibly flowing the end is somewhere in the hashed area. And so over time, you can see that the river has decreased in flow extent. In 2009 was when we saw the upgrade. So immediately after the upgrade, there was a decrease in flow with the increased recharge. And then in 2013, another critical point in time is when a new treatment facility went online in Nogales, Sonora, to treat some wastewater that some of which would normally have come to the U.S. So a diversion of water that stays in Mexico. So yes, we've seen a decrease in flow extent. Just to look at the amount of effluent being discharged, we have total amount in black, and then light gray is the total effluent coming from Sonora, Mexico, and the total in the dark gray from Arizona. So the Nogales treatment plant is binational. It treats wastewater from both countries, which is a unique instance, and then the water flows north into the U.S., or it's released in the U.S. side. And though the amount of effluent discharged into the river has come down a little bit in recent years, the amount coming from Mexico has actually stayed pretty constant or fairly stable in recent years. And the decrease that we've seen is mainly from the Arizona side. We're not really sure why on that, but in 2013 you do see a little drop that is likely represented by the new treatment facility going online. And since that time, we've learned that a lot of what they're treating at that facility are new hookups. So, but Mexico is very interested in expanding capacity at that facility, and it could be over time that more of the effluent is diverted to the new facility. And I'll touch on that again in a little bit. So we're also looking at riparian vegetation, and so if you would expect that if the river is shortening, we're going to have trees and riparian vegetation that is stressed at the farthest end. And so that's actually what we've been seeing, though we're not formally, we haven't formally measured this in any way, but looking at one spot on the river, this is in the Amato Reach, where in August of 2010 we see so the year after the facility was upgraded, we see that these willows are indeed stressed And then looking at it from an aerial perspective, this is going back into March, we see that there's green vegetation, there's trees there. Go to 2011, it's not looking so green there anymore, but there are still some trees. In January of 2016, the trees are no longer there. They've died and have been washed out. And this is one site that has seen a lot of changes. And this part of the river in that area has traditionally had less riparian willow and cottonwood vegetation just because of the hydrology. And so it might have been that the effluent, poor water quality, and the effluent making it that far, maybe we had more riparian vegetation than it was supposed to have, and now we're going into a more natural situation. But in any case, we're seeing those changes in vegetation. And the trees in the Tubac Reach are likely more stable. We have a riparian vegetation map that was done in 2006, and so we haven't updated since then, but these areas in light green are the cottonwood vegetation. Those are likely very stable because the groundwater in this reach appears to be very stable. So groundwater, the depth to groundwater is important for cottonwoods and willows with shallow root systems. And if your data point is in the green area, the depth to the groundwater is sustaining mature cottonwoods. If the point is in the blue area, the water is thought to be too deep to sustain cottonwoods. And we have limited data on groundwater, but in general, for the data that we do have, it looks like the Tubac Reach has had very stable conditions, and that's in the middle, and the Rio Rico Reach as well. And Amado is where we start seeing the deeper groundwater conditions. And the wells that are represented in the blue area for both the Rio Rico and the Amado Reach are, for Rio Rico, it's the point like the closest to the release of the effluent. So maybe it's just not enough. It's too close to the release point to benefit from the recharge. And in the Amado Reach, those wells are the furthest out. So at that point, we're maybe beyond the area with recharge. But the Tubac area is also thought to be an area with naturally shallow groundwater and a gaining reach where the groundwater is more often coming up out of the ground and into the stream bed. So overall, for the Upper Santa Cruz, we've seen a lot of improvements with river health, and so we've even though the flow extent has reduced over time and we've seen some reductions in riparian vegetation and aquatic habitat available, overall we've seen the value of having effluent, even though it's not a natural, it's not how the river naturally was. The effluent is providing an important service, and the key part is having the high enough quality effluent is important for allocating water to the river. And so next, and effluent is not secure. So in the Upper Santa Cruz, about 70 to 80% of the water is coming from Mexico, and they own that water, and there's no reason that they are required to continue to release it into the river. They could build some infrastructure to take the effluent and bring it back to Mexico, or they could build infrastructure in Mexico to treat their wastewater and keep it in Mexico. And on the U.S. side, of course, we could, I don't believe there's any current effort to have more use of, build a reclaimed water system in the Upper Santa Cruz area, but, that could be something in the future to meet water needs. And so in terms of allocating water for the river, we're now at a point where it's important to identify the community values and the conservation priorities along this stretch of the river, and really looking to find binational solutions that would benefit both Mexico and the US. And so we're working with partners on all three of these items. And we have a lot of similar opportunities for the lower Santa Cruz. And I'm going to transition now to the story that we're seeing on the lower Santa Cruz. So now we're moving downstream into the northwest part of Tucson. And for this work, we've been partnering with Pima County on the Living River series. And they were familiar with our work on the Upper Santa Cruz and said, hey, we know that the two treatment facilities, Agua Nueva, formerly known as Roger Treatment Plant, and Tres Rios, which also had a different name, they are getting significant upgrades. The Agua Nueva plant is a whole new plant that they were building, and Tres Rios was had significant upgrades, and they wanted specifically to see what the changes to the river would be. And so while in the Upper Santa Cruz we just conveniently had this before, during, and after, we actually planned for this with the lower Santa Cruz with Pima County. So here's again the photo of the headwaters of the lower, what we're calling the lower Santa Cruz. And we use the terms upper and lower just in reference to the current effluent dependent stretches. There's a lot of different names being used for different parts of the river, so I always like to just remind people of what I mean when I say lower. So we're talking about from just north of the Sweetwater Wetlands, which is just out of this, just at the bottom of this photo. For those of you familiar with the Sweetwater Wetlands, which is a really important birding location on the Santa Cruz, if you walk north, you'll get to this point where the water is added to the riverbed, and then the water snakes towards the northwest. And this is the new Agua Nueva facility that was created. So as with the upper series, we had the 2013 water year was our baseline before upgrades happened. The upgrades happened during the 2014 water year, so it's kind of a during. We had 1 quarter of data where the upgrades hadn't been completed yet, and then the rest of the year was after upgrades. And then 2015 is our first water year with the a full year of data post-upgrade. And we're working on the 4th report in this series right now, so I'm just going to focus on what we've been seeing for the first 3 years, but I might throw in some of what we're seeing in 2016. And so as with the Upper Santa Cruz, we saw tremendous improvements in water quality and clarity. So in both systems, when you would first go to the river, the water was cloudy. It wasn't. It was definitely not clear. And then after the upgrades, suddenly it seemed like a more natural system, and you could easily forget about the source of water. So really nice from a visual perspective if you're enjoying the river. And again, a slightly different graphic here to talk about ammonia, but we saw the same kind of pattern. So here I have the river going from left to right, from upstream to downstream, the 2 treatment facilities. We have 3 reaches of 3 rivers, Cortero Narrows and Marana Flats. And before the upgrade in 2013, we were seeing really high levels of ammonia in the river, particularly in the 3 Rivers Reach. And that Agua Nueva facility, before it was upgraded, it was a very old facility. It needed a wholesale rebuild. And then I believe ammonia also degrades over time as it moves downstream. And so that's another reason for seeing the decline in levels of ammonia in the river as you move from left to right. But overall, levels are really high. And in the first full year after the upgrade, we're seeing huge decreases in levels of ammonia and oftentimes not detected. And again, the standard for wildlife changes with temperature and pH. So there's not just one amount that I can say it has to be, less than 5. But generally, I think it's yeah, I think 3 or less is a general rule of thumb, but it depends on temperature and pH. But key message, as with what we saw in the Upper Santa Cruz, significant decreases in ammonia. And so we've seen increased levels of fish in the river, which is really great. On the Lower Santa Cruz, we saw fish even before the upgrades, but there was only one species, the western mosquito fish, and they were only in the downstream-most areas. And since the upgrades, we've seen fish in all 3 reaches and up to actually 5 species. This past year, we had 2 different species of sunfish. And while all of these species, the bullhead, the carp, and the sunfish, like the mosquito fish, they're all non-native, but it's really exciting to see that fish, are able to survive in the river. And so now it might just be a matter of time waiting for fish the natives to be reintroduced into the river from upstream, although we could potentially help speed this up if we were to reintroduce, for example, the native longfin dace into the river. Because it might take a little more time given the distance between the 2 stretches of river for a natural flood to bring them. But it did happen with the with the top minnow on the Upper Santa Cruz. So really exciting to see this increased fish diversity. And again, with the higher quality of water, we've been seeing high infiltration and greater recharge, reducing flow extent. So we're looking at flow extent in 2 ways. We're looking at, again, flow in June, and we're also looking at the number of dry days at Trico Road. Trico Road has a stream gauge that U.S. Geological Survey monitors on a daily basis. So at least at one place, at the end of the study area, we can see how often the river is making it all the way to the end of the 23 miles to get a sense of daily changes in flow extent. And so before the upgrade happened, all 23 miles were flowing in June, and it was flowing every day all the way to Trico Road. It was often going past the county line to Pinal County. And in 2015, we saw a shorter amount of miles of flow in June, so only 16 miles with 2 dry spots, and then 244 days that were dry at Trico Road. And there's a couple things going in here. A majority of this change is due to the increased infiltration and greater recharge. But the dry spot in the Three Rivers area is also related to water management, because during the upgrade process, some of the wastewater that used to go to Agua Nueva now goes to Tres Rios, so there's less water being released in the Three Rivers reach, and it's recharging faster. So now we often have a little bit of a dry spot before the next treatment facility, and then in Marana Flats, we have areas, and right at near Alvar Valley Road, there's both natural and human management of water that have influenced the number of dry days at Trico Road. So actually the number of dry days in 2015 was the highest we've seen in the last 3 years, including 2016. And that's because there was a berm along the river that was for flood control that was breached, and water was able to enter a former sand and gravel pit, and so created Marana Lake, which has now become an important hot spot and birding hotspot. And town of Marana is looking at figuring out how to maintain this bird habitat, and the river has, the amount of water flowing into there has changed depending on flows and flooding conditions. But at one point, the entire river was flowing into this area and then flowing back out, and so some water was getting kind of held up in this new lake, and so it increased the number of dry days at Trico Road. But the number of dry days can actually be reduced because of a different berm in the Marana Flats area, where we have a diversion for off-channel recharge and agriculture that happens. So there's an earthen berm that gets put up to have the river diverted to another channel that feeds a farm and a recharge facility. And that berm is often breached during big flow events. And so when that happens, the water tends to make it more often to Trico Road. So the biggest factor is that improvement in water quality, but just wanted to try to paint the picture that the natural and human management of water is also a factor in flow extent, and will become maybe a greater factor as we move forward, now that the water quality is higher. As we saw on the Upper Santa Cruz, Effluent is supporting our wetland species. So we're not measuring riparian vegetation in the same way, but you'll see from this photo just upstream we have vegetation in the river, but it's vegetation that supports, that doesn't need regular presence of water, and tends to be species that are grow better in low nitrogen environments. And then we add the water to the river, and we find species that need regular water and can tolerate conditions with greater nitrogen. Sorry, and this is another photo. So we have more of our streamside. We're looking at streamside vegetation, both whether or not they're wetland species or whether they grow well with high or low amounts of nitrogen, as well as our trees. And our trees are only measured every few years. But last year, and streamside vegetation is measured every year. And what we've seen with streamside vegetation is the areas that have had the change have been in these areas that are drying at the end of the Three Rivers Reach and at the end of the Marana Flats. And what we've seen is that when it's dry, the plants that are there are still classified as wetland plants, but they shift more towards those species. They shift more towards these species that are in what we call upland areas, in the drier areas. And then if water is present in the river, then they shift back towards the wetland plants. So it's really the areas with the most change in terms of streamside vegetation has been dependent on whether or not there's water there. We've seen more change in these same areas with the wetland trees. Specifically cover of Gooding's willow, we saw a big reduction in cover of live Gooding's willow and dead Gooding's willow between the baseline and 2015. And a lot of this is in those drying sections. So again, very similar pattern to what we saw in the Upper Santa Cruz. Oh, and this is just a photo in one of the parts of the Marana Flats that has seen some drying. We now have some willows that have died. And though some of these areas in 2016 did have some flowing water again, and there was some willow and tamarisk recruitment, so it's possible that could come back, but it will be, dependent on conditions. Something unique to the lower Santa Cruz that we did not do on the Upper Santa Cruz was tracking social impacts changes to the river. And so odor is not necessarily something that is a river health factor, but it's more of a social factor for enjoyment of the river. For those of you that are familiar with the Tucson area or live in this area, it used to be that you would drive south on I-10 and you knew when you arrived to Tucson when you could smell the wonderful greeting smell of the Agua Nueva, well now Agua Nueva facility. And now there's very minimal odor leaving the facility. We weren't able to track odor along the entire river, but at the facilities where a large part of the odor problem was coming from, the levels that leave the facility are far less than what's allowed by the permit. And the first report that we put out showed the modeled extent of and intensity of odors before and after the upgrade, and it's big difference. And just going out to the river now, it doesn't smell like it's effluent at all. It just smells like a natural river. So this is huge for enjoying the river, for people that are living in the region, a really big improvement. So I'm glad I'm getting to my last slides here because I want to leave time for questions. But as with the Upper Santa Cruz, we've seen a lot of improvements in river health, and again, the flow extent has reduced. And you know, effluent, like on the Upper Santa Cruz, is not secure, and though our solutions for allocating water, it's a little different situation here on the Lower Santa Cruz that I can get into, but now is the time to define what the community values and what are conservation priorities, and find balanced solutions for maintaining our values and priorities. In particular, for those of you that live in the area, or maybe you've heard that Tucson Water has been proposing to create a third stretch of flowing river in the Santa Cruz, and taking some of the water that's currently flowing in the Lower Santa Cruz and bringing it upstream to the downtown part of Tucson, which is a really exciting idea because it's a much more visible part of the river. It's kind of the heart of the Tucson cultural heritage. There's a lot of rich cultural resources and movement to restore and maintain this heritage. But at the same time, we don't want to take away from what we've now created on the Lower Santa Cruz, which has incredible habitat, and it's becoming a bigger community amenity. Pima County has invested in the Loop Recreation Trail that goes often on both sides of the river. There's numerous river parks, and so there's a lot of interest in maintaining that corridor as well. So I could touch, depending on the interest and questions and time, I could touch on some of the complexities that around water and why their effluent might be, there's interest in moving water out of the river in the Lower Santa Cruz. And so I'll leave it at that for now and move into questions.
All right, thank you, Claire. We have the chat box open, and your line's muted still, so go ahead as a first resort, drop any questions you may have in the chat box, and we'll take care of them that way. After we run that for a couple minutes, we'll go ahead and open up your phone lines and see how that goes. And while we're waiting for some questions to roll in, I just want to say, Claire, thank you for presenting. I'm sitting up here at the Rio Salado Center along the edges of the Salt River in Phoenix. And it's just really interesting to see, the Salt River here, it was restored to be a flood control channel. So again, we have a river that was worked on for really human-centric needs. And then we have this kind of secondary effect of wildlife and habitat conservation that wasn't the main goal at all. So it's just kind of cool to see how the two channels and the two cities are very analogous.
Yeah.
We have this slide up here now. Just so you guys on the line know, we do have one more webinar in this series. The link is up there. We'll be talking about the Governor's Water Augmentation Council. The legislature is now closed, but there's still a few opportunities for action, so check that out as well.
I see, or I don't know if you want to, Steve, if you want me to start answering questions. I do see one I didn't look up at past, but
okay.
I see one question about what devices were being used to monitor fish populations, and there's a combination. We use seines, so these large nets that we drag through the water to try to catch fish that are in the water. And then we also use an electroshocker, a backpack that delivers a mild shock to the fish in the water, and then they become stunned temporarily and you catch them out of the water with a dip net, or they are carried downstream and we catch them in the seine that we use to kind of block we have the seine set up as a blocking net, so it catches any of the fish that go downstream. And then with these different techniques, you try to sample all the different types of habitat in the area that you're surveying. So there might be a pool, in which case you want to shock the pool, or there might be a run over some cobbles and you try to move through it as quickly as you can, dragging the net. And so we're really trying to get at presence of different species. What are projections for effluent from Roger Road facility to go into Santa Cruz? In terms of projections moving forward, so in the context of, I'm not sure if this is in the context of, Tucson Water has been releasing, there's been a flow of water coming from the Agua Nueva into the Santa Cruz. More of the water that used to flow into the river has been diverted to recharge basins right next to the river. More has been diverted to those, and then there's possible that if Tucson Water uses some of the reclaimed water in the river upstream in the Tucson area, that more could be, so less would come out from Agua Nueva into the river, into the Three Rivers. But Tucson Water is looking to, they've been looking at ways of maintaining vegetation in this area and ideas of maybe not releasing the rest of the water that would stay there on a continuous basis, maybe having a pulse of water so that the flow extent gets further down. I don't know if that answers your question exactly. I don't have a number at the top at my fingertips right now in terms of projections of effluent, but what is the chemical difference in the better water quality that allows for greater water recharge? So that gets back to the nutrients and like ammonia and other forms of nitrogen. So it's having, when you have, so nutrients like nitrogen are a good thing for plants and animals, but too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing. So as I mentioned, there are organisms that live in the riverbed that break down those nutrients, and they become so abundant that they actually block all the pores between the river sediments, and so they seal off the riverbed. And so without a flood to come through and scour the riverbed, you don't get as much recharge. So with the cleaner water quality, you don't have as high a need to break down the nutrients, and then you start, creating holes in your clogging layer. I don't know if people are familiar with wastewater treatment facilities where they just one of the treatment processes is to have the water infiltrate through, use the soil to clean the water as it infiltrates through the bottom of a pond. And periodically the pond needs to be scoured, the bottom, because it gets clogged. And so that's essentially what's happening in the river too. Without a flood, the water quality just creates a clogging layer. Hopefully that answers your question. On the Upper Santa Cruz, we actually, some of the research of a colleague was able to show that trees were not accessing the water in the river even though it was flowing, because there's a trace element that was found that would only be possible, it was only coming from the wastewater, and she was able to show that it was in the tree ring. So she found evidence of this element in the tree, but it's only present after the upgrade to the treatment plant. So before the upgrade, the tree wasn't accessing the water from the river, it was accessing groundwater. And then after the upgrade, the tree was able to access water from the river, and the trace element suddenly appears in the tree ring, which is a pretty cool research piece.
Another one's not.
Oh, sorry, say that?
Go ahead, Claire. Good.
Oh, I was just going to say that if anyone, at any point in time, if you think of something and you have a question about Santa Cruz, you're welcome to email me, or you can look on Sonoran Institute's website. For those of you in the Tucson area, I really encourage you to get out and see the river. There's a lot of great places on both stretches of the river where you can access the river. And if you're in the Tucson area, and you can join Tucson Conserve to Enhance program, where you can be part of a movement to link your water savings, your water use, to local riparian enhancement. So we're restoring our urban washes with funding that's from water savings and donations. Just a little plug if you're looking for something to do.
Good deal. Thank you. We're always looking for ways for our members to take action as a result of these webinars, so I appreciate you including that. It doesn't look like we have any other additional questions in the chat box, so I'm going to open up the phone line really quick, just see if that gets us anybody else. Probably get some feedback, but anybody out there on the line that has any remaining questions before we log off? I don't think we do. All right. Well, thank you again, Claire, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope to see you on the next one.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.